I was part of this group of advocates for Alzheimer's Association that was in your office and got to stop in up there and do that annually. I'm a board member for our local chapter, and then nationally we try to visit with our lawmakers and with our great staff.
It's actually one thing we're fighting Trump on with some of the NIH cuts he wants to do. So we want to resist that in Congress because, I mean, you know, at the end of the day, Alzheimer's, cancer, some of these things, it costs money to research, but if you get that breakthrough, that's obviously saves lives, which is the most important thing, but it saves from a fiscal perspective trillions of dollars if you can knock out some of these things, and so we're getting closer and closer.
Thank you. Yeah. You get it. That's exactly what I was trying to share with people.
Well, that's the thing, you know, our government, you know, there are very few things that we even do nowadays that can potentially benefit everyone. I mean, I would argue military things, that would be one, but you know, it's like, and maybe there's a role for this, but it's like, you know, you give this person a housing subsidy, whatever, that's kind of like taking money from one. This is something that potentially can have society-wide ramifications. And so, and I support him reducing the overall budget in certain areas, but it's like, that's really haphazard when you start doing that because those are valuable dollars. And we just did the Cures Act last year, which was a good bill, and it's kind of the same theory is that, look, let's make this stretch now and do what we can, because honestly, we're going to probably go bankrupt unless something happens. Maybe it's an economic growth game changer, but I think the health aspect of it, if you know those breakthroughs could potentially avert us from going bankruptcy. So from a fiscal perspective, it really makes a lot of sense.
So I don't have a personal strong, what's that? Yeah, strong family. You know, I don't have grandma and grandpa died with Alzheimer's or whatever. It was that financial component that kind of grabbed me 5 or 6 years ago to go, if we don't do something now, it's going to have that impact. Obviously, Florida, ground zero for the aging population, right? So
it's going to, I mean, it's going to get worse. So I mean, we definitely need to do it. So.
Yeah. So here's what I'm hoping for. Our visit, I don't have a time parameter on it, but I want to be able to pick it up and put it into our Sunday morning show.
Sure.
I certainly want to get news of the day stuff. I mean, there's a possibility that what we chat about today, we'll say, hey, let's put this part in our 6 o'clock newscast or whatever. But why don't we just start here? Just look at me, forget about this guy and that camera and all that. And here's, syncs up that camera right there. Tell me about your thoughts on being on recess. There's a lot of good work that gets done here in district rather than in Washington, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have a chance to really be on the ground and talk with folks. You know, I've visited a number of businesses. I've held kind of, you know, mini town halls with employees. I'm doing a big public event tonight in Daytona Beach. And we've been in session so much that we've only had 1 week where we weren't in session since January 3rd. And I think I calculated that I had not spent more than 2 nights consecutive in my own bed since the beginning of the year. And so, because sometimes when we'll have a break for a few days, I went to Israel one time, and there's other things you end up doing. So when you have a little bit of time, it allows you to get back and take care of listening to the folks locally. So it is valuable time to take care of.
Yeah, so you and Congressman Yoho from our area are kind of the senior guys now, because we've had this turnover specifically in Jacksonville with Congressman Rutherford and Lawson now there. What's some of that experience mean? What have you gained in these few years that you've served in the House that you're able to, you know, be a leader now for our region?
Well, you learn a little bit how the trains work. Now, I'm also someone as a reformer, I want to change some of that stuff too, so you kind of got to walk a fine line there to a certain extent, but I think you do build relationships with people, and I think if you show proficiency in certain issues, then folks will listen to you. So, for example, with national security, it's been something I've been involved with a lot. Well, we're trying to bring an aircraft carrier down to Florida at Mayport. So, you know, I have a little bit more credibility making that case as somebody who's now been there a few terms, has kind of shown that I understand America's role in the world, and then I have a Navy background, I'm in the reserves. And so there are ways where, you know, you're just having built the relationships, you can do more. And obviously working with the administration helps too, because I think they're receptive of expanding the Navy, getting to 350 ships, and I think a component of that makes sense that you would disperse our East Coast carriers and have one in Florida.
Yeah. You mentioned working with the administration. There's a few issues that you've worked and said, hey, President Trump's office, you need to maybe change the approach. And some of that was health care. That first health care bill that didn't get voted on, you had said, not sure we would have voted on that anyway. Are there other things that need to be adjusted there? where you as a member of the House are saying, White House, need to do this our way?
So I think with the healthcare, Congress had kind of written that in secret, at the leadership level, and then kind of put it out March, I think, 7th, and said, hey, take it or leave it, we're going to pass this in 2 or 3 weeks. Well, that is not the way you deal with an issue of that magnitude. So I think the White House has actually since then been very receptive to the idea that you need to talk to the members of the conference and build a consensus. Then once you have a consensus built, then you bring a bill to the floor. You don't just schedule a vote and say, come hell or high water, we're just going to vote on this thing. It doesn't matter if it's going to work or if it's ready for prime time. And so I think that working with the White House has actually been pretty good since that bill failed, because they understand that there were shortcomings. I mean, the #1 critique that we have of Obamacare is, oh, it's imploding, the markets are imploding, the prices are going up, deductibles, people can't choose their plans. Well, guess what? This bill really did very little to address that. And so if you're not dealing with the problems that voters have, there's going to be problems. So the bill wasn't ready for prime time. We're trying to get it there. But I think the White House kind of sees when you're dealing with the Congress, help build the consensus. I don't think it was the White House's fault, because I think it was done in kind of behind closed doors in Congress, and I think that was probably the main reason why it failed. But I think they've had a lot of good ideas since then.
You mentioned national security. You're the chairman of one of the subcommittees. Which one is that?
National Security Oversight Subcommittee.
Okay. Yeah, I got that right. Shocker. Hey, so on the national security side, how do you feel about what's going on with North Korea and obviously some terrible attacks there in Syria that America has responded to?
Well, North Korea, you really have kind of a slow motion Cuban Missile Crisis. You have this plump, immature, irrational kid in charge of this country, which is a brutal dictatorship. It's imprisoned 24 million people for decades now. And I think the chance that Kim miscalculates is probably higher with regards to his regime than probably any of the other rogue states that are out there. And so they're a nuclear power. They may not have the ability to reach the continental United States now, but they're trying and they're close, and they represent a huge threat to the neighborhood, particularly South Korea, because Seoul is about 30 miles south of the DMZ. So this, I said a couple months ago, North Korea was going to be a crisis on this president's watch. It looks like we're pretty much there now. And the good news is it seems that China's been receptive to trying to stand North Korea down. And I think if China is willing to exert their pressure on North Korea, we can probably deal with it in a way short of having some really high stakes brinksmanship, which North Korea couldn't deal with Western military might, but they could do a lot of damage kind of as Kim's regime's going out the door. And obviously we want to avoid that if we can.
Yeah. How do you feel about the different stance, I guess, that the White House takes now with this president versus President Obama? I mean, the way that the president, Trump, speaks to these other nations is a lot different than President Obama did, right?
Well, certainly he's got his own style when he does the Twitter and whatnot, but I think it is important to look at the actual actions that are taken. And I think what he's done is shown himself to be very decisive. I mean, if you look at what happened in Syria, there was a chemical attack on a Tuesday. On Wednesday, it was being reported. We're kind of getting the facts. And then on Thursday, his military advisors provided him with a course of action, and he acted immediately. And I think the same thing with what you're seeing in Afghanistan, where he says, look, if we're in this fight, we got to be in it to win. I'm going to empower my military commanders and let them use the tools that we've given them to the fullest extent possible. So I think those are important just for what they were, but I think they have a larger significance, both in terms of our adversaries, North Korea, Iran, even Russia and China, that say, wait, there's a new sheriff in town. But then also, I think when you use something like the Moab, our troops, to me, that boosts their morale, because we've been fighting in Afghanistan with very restrictive rules of engagement, and I think we've lost service members because of that. Now we're saying, look, we're going to go whole hog and we're going to fight to win. Yeah.
Let me shift topics just a little bit here. I saw that you had asked FEMA for some reporting on how things had gone in the wake of Hurricane Matthew. Where do things stand there, and are you getting the answers that you really need to address how FEMA has responded?
Well, we didn't get the answers that we wanted at the hearing, so we're having them give us answers in writing. But the problem with some of these local communities have is they clean up all this debris in some of the neighborhoods, and then they apply to have the FEMA reimburse them. And it takes sometimes years for them to get reimbursed. And so you have a tab of $150,000, $200,000 for a local municipality or community. That's a huge deal. Yeah, absolutely. So what we want to do is cut through the red tape. Let's speed this up so that the money can be sent back to the local communities for reimbursement. And if they're not entitled to that, then be clear about that up front so they know what they can do and what they can't do. There's a lot of confusion with a lot of these FEMA rules, and we want to try to avoid that so that we can streamline this and get it right.
Any concern that there would be more fraud because you're trying to streamline things or make things happen faster?
Well, the thing is, on certain things, I mean, we know a storm came through. So yeah, could they say, okay, we have this one storm, it's like kind of a once in however many years it's come through the area, and now we're going to try to leverage that to get some debris picked up in some random neighborhood. I suppose you could do that, but realistically, we saw the storm, we saw the damage, and I think these folks really just, they want to get their neighborhoods back to normal as soon as possible in their communities, so we should want FEMA to play a kind of a constructive role in that rather than let this linger and linger as long as until the FEMA finally decides to respond.
Yeah. What else did you want to chat about that I didn't get to? I don't want to take all day from you, but I'm enjoying the conversation.
Okay. Well, I think you know, you're going to see going forward in terms of the international front, the messages that have been sent recently with Trump's actions. I think you've seen his national security team perform ably on the world stage. Secretary Tillerson, Secretary Mattis, and then McMaster working in the White House. That you know, we're starting to see the prospect of really coming together with a strong coalition in the Middle East. He welcomed the Egyptian president, Sisi, who's very anti-jihad and anti-Islamic extremism. Obviously, Israel, the relationship much better. The King of Jordan, strong relationship. Now, because we're taking a stronger tack against Iran, the big Shia threat to the region, you have all those Gulf states, the Arab countries, they want to work with the United States to fight Iranian influence. I think that's important in the fight against ISIS, because if the choice between ISIS for the average Sunni Arab is either ISIS, the Sunni terrorist group, or Iranian-backed governments, or America that's tending towards Iran with the nuclear deal and everything, well, they're more apt to actually choose ISIS than now. If America is standing against Iran, you have all these other Arab countries that are standing with us against Iran, you have a much better chance to fight ISIS and still have Sunni Arabs choose a different way. And so that is just, I think the pieces are in place for that, so you could potentially see some really positive developments in the Middle East. Still going to be a difficult region, still going to have a whole bunch of pathologies, but I think from where we were 2013, 2014 as ISIS started taking over to where we could be a year or two from now, you could potentially see some positive gains.
Yeah. Do you believe what was spoken about in this last year? Did we somehow create ISIS by pulling out too soon or not finishing the job in some of those Middle Eastern countries that we'd been in the 2000s?
Well, I don't think we created ISIS. So, for example, when I was in Iraq, we were in Western Iraq, Fallujah, Ramadi. It was Al-Qaeda in Iraq at that time. We defeated them, and they basically fled to Syria and then became ISIS, Islamic State of Iraq initially, and then in Syria. So that was always there, but I think what we did is when we pulled the troops out, that really allowed ISIS to then go back into Iraq without much resistance at all. And what happens in the Middle East is the most brutal force tends to end up winning, and ISIS obviously is second to none when it comes to brutality. So that initial invasion into Iraq, had we had a residual force, we would have been able to squash them like a bug, but because we didn't have the troops there, it really let them get a foothold in Western Iraq and Mosul and other places, and we're still fighting that fight right now, and it would have been easier to deal with it on the front end, because now on the back end when you're dealing with it, you know, you'll have Americans that are helping out, we work with the Kurds, but you have a lot of the Iranian militias, and a lot of those are Shia militias, so when you're in these Sunni areas, it's not the best way to go about it, and so even when there's been some gains, there's kind of sometimes a drawback. That would not have been an issue had we just dealt with them before they ever got a foothold.
It's Middle East is confusing for so many people, and obviously you've got a depth of understanding and experience there that most don't. So.
The other thing I would say is, you know, as we're coming up to the end of Trump's 100 days, one of the things that I think helped him get elected was his message to drain the swamp in Washington. And that involved, one of the things it involved was term limits for members of Congress. I'm actually leading that fight in the House. The other thing it involved was a lot of ethics reforms, a 5-year ban on members of Congress lobbying, a lifetime ban lobbying for foreign governments, same thing with congressional staff. And I think that that would have been an easy legislative win in his first 100 days. We drafted the bill just to track his speech so that we could put that out, because I think it'd be popular with Republicans, Independents, and Democrats. And so I think it was a mistake not to have that be one of the first initiatives early on. So what I'm trying to do now is get with the White House and say, hey, let's push this soon, because these are the types, I think, of victories that aren't partisan in nature, but really show that you're a reformer trying to change Washington instead of somebody who's been captivated by Washington.
Yeah, is that something that you've discussed with Mr. Trump or other people in the White House?
We discussed it with the White House. They said they didn't want to necessarily do it right out of the gate because, look, some members of Congress don't like it because you're basically telling a member of Congress, you got to wait 5 years before you cash in at K Street. To me, that's how it should be. So I'm not going to shed a tear about that. But I think they worried that they could maybe have alienated some members early. Well, now we're in a situation with maybe you resuscitate healthcare. I think you can. You're going to move on to taxes, but that's going to be tough as well. To me, this would be an easy victory, and I think one that a lot of Americans would say, you know what, we do need to drain this swamp. This is one step to doing that. And I do know we have talked to the White House about the term limits push. They are going to do it, but it's going to be later in this year. So we're ready for that as well. And that's another one, I think, again, that crosses partisan lines. You get Republicans, Independents, and Democrats to say, yeah, we should do term limits. We shouldn't have people up there for 40 years that basically just become dinosaurs. Let's get some new blood in there, and let's get, your goal should be get up there and get things done rather than go up there and then your main goal being to stay there for as long as possible.